It's been a year since both of the new Novation Circuits released. Do I still love them as much as I did when they first dropped? What's up, and welcome back to Gabe Miller Music. I have been a hardcore circuit user for years now, starting with the original circuit back in the day, and continuing with the tracks and the rhythm. Full disclosure, Novation did include me in the product launches for both devices, and as such sent me both devices for free, but they didn't get any say over the content then, and that continues now. They didn't get to see this video before it came out. All of these are completely my own thoughts from using these things extensively. All that being said, let's jump into it. For this video, I mostly want to focus on both devices completely on their own terms, but I do want to mention what happened to my original circuit. Ever since I got the tracks, which is pretty much the direct upgrade, I just didn't really touch my original circuit, despite having used it very extensively before that. This is just a perfect upgrade for me. It's a better experience in pretty much every way, in my opinion. So eventually, after it sat unused for months, I gave my original circuit away to a friend who I'd been mentoring on and off in music production. I knew that he would actually get some proper use out of it and appreciate its significance to me, so it went to a good home. I felt a bit like Andy from Toy Story 3 giving his toys away. But I have absolutely no regrets, and I think that's a pretty good indicator of what I think of the new circuits. The Novation Circuit Tracks is a fantastic portable production device and my go-to brain for a larger hardware setup. For those of you unfamiliar, here's a very quick explanation of what it is and what it does. The Novation Circuit Tracks is a completely self-contained music production device with 2 polyphonic synth tracks with the built-in synth engine, 4 monophonic drum tracks that can accept samples, and 2 dedicated MIDI tracks. We'll get back to those in a second. It has a built-in rechargeable battery that only lasts for about 4 hours, which I initially worried would not be enough, but it seems to retain charge pretty well, so practically it's actually never been a problem. And if you do need to charge it, you can use just a phone charger power bank very easily. It's all plastic, but its build quality feels quite good. It's very thin and sleek, and that does elevate the experience quite a bit. I do feel a little nervous putting it into a backpack, but it's held up pretty well, but I do have to be kind of careful with it when doing that. I should also note the play button has deteriorated a bit over time. Like, I have to press a bit harder or a bit longer sometimes to get it to play now, but other than that, it's held up great. And the pads feel great to play. They're big enough for some proper finger drumming and they're sensitive enough for that, but I've never had any problems with double triggers or mistriggers or anything like that. They're some of the best in the game. They feel great to play. Because of its light but sleek build, its standalone nature, and most importantly, its fantastic user interface, the Circuit Tracks is one of my primary go-to devices when I come home from a long day at work and I just want to sit on the couch and casually tinker with some song ideas. It's great for chill, casual use, but it's also got the capacity to expand into a full studio setup. Like I've indicated, it's very nice to use by itself, but that's only part of its full power, and you will want to use it with other stuff once you start to bump into the limitation of only having 2 synth tracks. But that's where the brilliance of this device comes in. And right off the bat, I should mention, the Circuit Tracks is not the only device to do what I'm about to tell you about, and it's not the first, and it's not even the only budget device to do this. But in my personal experience of trying music gear, it does it the cleanest and the most top to bottom integrated of any device that I've tried. Remember those 2 MIDI tracks that I mentioned earlier? They can't make any sound on their own, but they can control external devices via the 2 MIDI outs on the back of the device. They can also process audio via the two inputs on the back of the device. And I should be very clear here, these two inputs cannot record sound into the device. What they can do is feed audio back into the circuit to be processed by its reverb, delay, and sidechain. This means that you can control a synth with the circuit via MIDI, pipe that synth audio back into the circuit, then listen through the headphone jack and or record its stereo outputs. Add another synth to the mix and you've got a full 4-synth track hardware jamming setup. To put into context how well this works, I'm lazy. I don't like complicated music production setups with a lot of friction associated with them. The Circuit Tracks single-handedly got me into the table full of gear type setups that I've seen a lot of other synth heads do, but never even bothered with until the Tracks came along. That got me working with multiple interconnected devices because it's just such a pleasant user experience, and even troubleshooting with it is pretty damn easy. And the best part is that it brings together the best of both worlds. I can just casually start a song on the circuit by itself, maybe while traveling or just on the couch in a chill production session, and then later bring it into the studio to expand it into a fuller setup and do a full jamming session out of that. It's got room to grow into. Hell, if you're really on a budget or just want to test the waters with music production hardware, you could get just the Circuit Tracks by itself and use it completely self-contained and be perfectly happy with it. Then, over time, you could slowly expand your setup with a couple of hardware synths, maybe even super compact budget ones. Here's an example of what that looks and sounds like in practice. And bear in mind, the only things going into my audio interface and being recorded are the circuit's stereo outputs. I've also gotten a lot of mileage out of connecting the Circuit Tracks to other groove boxes, especially the Roland MC101. Now, as great as all this is, it's not without its flaws. This thing that I'm about to demonstrate was pointed out to me by some viewers. I actually didn't notice it explicitly. However, it does have a very small effect on your jamming experience. Somewhere along the pipeline, there is a tiny bit of latency introduced. For the most part, I don't notice it at all, but in this situation, I've got Synth 1 doing a little line and then MIDI 1 doing the exact same line. I've got a very short stabby sound on the Volca FM, and then I've got a very different sound on the internal synth track. So listen to what happens when I play them both together. Now, I'm going to zoom into the waveform to show you what that looks like, but there is a very tiny amount of latency introduced, and that means that any internal synth is heard hitting just a tiny bit late, like a tiny bit. And for most jams, especially if you've got a less stabby synth, you actually should be totally fine. However, if you've got like a fast running ARP or something, it will become a little bit more noticeable. So now I've slightly modified the patch on the Volca FM2 and I'm sending this little ARP part to it. So I'm going to unmute these other elements and you can hear the very subtle rub between the external synth and the internal stuff. You might be able to feel that latency just a little bit. But if I have, say, a slightly flowier part and I sidechain it to the kick and give it some effects and all that, it sounds a lot more natural. So that's definitely something to be aware of. In actual practice, I haven't had it affect my experience too much, and it's always come out sounding fine, but it is present, it is a problem, and it's a criticism that I only noticed after quite a while of using this thing, so I wanted to make sure to mention it. Moving on to the other major criticism, this one's a little more subjective, but some people are not big fans of the synth engine. Personally, I think it's fine, but I will readily admit that it can sometimes sound cheap or even have just some weird phase issues. And a lot of pack designers tend to play it fairly safe with either kind of standard subtractive synth type sounds or some generically growly, gritty basses. That's what it's best at, and in that context, it can really shine. And remember, part of the beauty is that you can expand the sound palette by connecting other synths. So I'll often use my dedicated hardware synths for the more kind of in-your-face, flashy sounds, and then use the circuit for more kind of bread and butter sounds. Because the built-in synth engine, while maybe a bit janky at times, is fairly versatile. Overall, I immediately imprinted on the circuit tracks as a replacement for my original circuit, and I've continued to use it a lot since. It's genuinely one of my favorite pieces of music gear that I own, to the point that if I had to get rid of all of my groove boxes and synths except for 2 groove boxes and 2 synths, I would keep the circuit tracks, the MPC-1, the Roland JU-06A, and the Arturia Microfreak, and that would honestly be plenty. However, if I had to get rid of all of my hardware and was only allowed to keep 1 portable groove box, I would keep the Circuit Rhythm, probably. Maybe the Roland MC-101, but probably the Circuit Rhythm. So, with that being said, let's get into the Circuit Rhythm next. And with that being said, I'm going to pause and eat some tater tots. When it was first released, the Novation Circuit Rhythm was greeted with a mix of tepid excitement, but mostly disappointment. After all, it's got 8 identical tracks, which is great, but all of them are monophonic, meaning that they can only play one sound at a time. This is already a deal breaker for quite a few people. Add to that the fact that all the tracks are mono in terms of the stereo spectrum. Any stereo sound that you load in will get collapsed down to mono, and there's nothing you can do to change that. You can bring some stereo-ness back with some reverb and delay, but still, for a lot of people, that's just not good enough, which is very much fair. It's a modern device in a modern time, and you would kind of expect a savvy company like Novation to know better. But let's go from there and just accept that. When I was able to get the circuit, I already knew this stuff going in, so I tempered my expectations accordingly, and I actually really liked it when it came out, and I stand by that, even though at the time it was a fairly unpopular opinion. Now, it seems like the community has warmed up to it a good bit, or at least the people who didn't see it as being for them have already bounced off, which, once again, I totally understand. I think the Trax is a much more mass-appealing device than the Rhythm is. I think the Rhythm is a bit more niche because if you love its interface, you'll really click with it and you'll just deal with the limitations. But if you don't see that as good enough, you're probably never gonna like it, which is very understandable. But personally, I really do. Because I'm such a big fan of the Novation Circuit user interface and overall user experience, I found the ability to load in any sound I could possibly imagine and having 8 tracks of that to be fantastic. I found that to be tremendously freeing, and in practice, I usually don't find that the monophonic nature of the tracks holds me back all that much. This is in part because you can switch between multiple sounds over the course of one track, so you can still build up a pretty dense sounding arrangement pretty quickly. And hell, people have been using the Polyan Tracker and the Electron Digitact, which are both very similar in that they're also 8-track monophonic devices, and people have gotten plenty out of those devices as well. And those are more similar to the Circuit Rhythm than you might think, and all of them are pretty damn flexible. The Circuit's built-in sound shaping controls are fairly basic, but they usually give me enough control to shape the sound that I need. I should mention I do really wish that these high and low pass filters had associated filter envelopes. They do not. That's very sad, but we do have an amp envelope, and also you can kind of fake it with some filter automation and maybe even pair that with some resampling. It's a bit of a workaround, but it's what we're working with here. I do actually really like using these as mixing tools, especially the high pass filter. I'll use it to cut lows on a bunch of my sounds. That way I keep my mix nice and clean and not muddy. And yes, I will happily go through the effort of properly mixing a song on this thing, because you absolutely can make full songs on this thing. I feel like it's gotten a bit of a reputation for being just a beat making device where you make short loops and that's about it. But because of its fantastic clip launching workflow, including the ability to switch between entire projects, you can absolutely make full songs on it. To be clear, I don't make as many full songs on the Circuit Rhythm as I have on the Circuit Tracks, but it's not close. Because of that whole project switching thing I just mentioned, one of my favorite go-to tricks is resampling an entire section of a song, loading that into a pad, chopping it up, and then building an entire second section of a song around that, like this. And yes, like I've alluded to a couple of times, the Circuit Rhythm can resample. And unlike the Circuit Tracks, its audio inputs can actually record sound into the circuit. They can pass sounds through as well, but they don't go to like a dedicated track, so they can't be sent to the reverb, delay, or sidechain. They do get processed by the grid effects though, which are an addition to the Circuit Rhythm that are fun, they're a bit gimmicky, but they can add some nice spice to a live jamming session or even be decent sound design tools. However, if you were hoping to get the Circuit Rhythm as the OP1 killer, the portable multi-track recorder of your dreams, stop right there. The amount of sample time that you have per pack is fairly limited, at least by modern standards, only 222 seconds, which gets gobbled up very quickly. So recording or loading longer musical passages into your circuit is pretty much out. 4 or 8 bar loops is probably the maximum I would go to. And yes, you do still have to deal with separate packs and the components software to load all that stuff in. While you can load multiple packs onto a micro SD card that you insert into the circuit, you can only have one active pack at a time. And by the way, that's the same on the Circuit Tracks. That's another deal breaker for a lot of people, which is very understandable, but I tend to view it as switching between packs is switching between different like styles of music and that kind of thing. There's definitely some friction associated with recording sounds into the circuit and especially loading sounds into the Circuit Rhythm. Hell, some people find the components software too fiddly and annoying to even make it worth it to bother with at all for them. That's another deal breaker. However, for me personally, it's worth working with. The component software is fine, and usually I like to have a separate session just to go ham and load a ton of sounds onto my circuit all at once. I'll go onto Splice, I'll go through a bunch of the sample packs that I have sitting around on my hard drive, and I'll just start bringing stuff in like crazy, and I'll make a few custom packs in one go. And then later, the next time I pick up my circuit, I've got all these new sounds to play with, and I've removed that aspect of friction. Now, all the sounds are just at my fingertips, and I'll try to keep stuff coherent on a pack-by-pack basis, so they'll be fairly versatile, but also probably themed around a certain style of music. Once again, once you've done a bit of legwork up front, maybe once every few months, then this becomes a fantastic casual couch beat-making device. Overall, in my opinion, both circuits are great budget music production devices that punch way above their weight. Over this last year, I've gotten a lot of use out of them, and despite how many new groove boxes I've tried on this channel over the past year, I keep coming back to the circuits. A large part of this is how intuitive they are and how well integrated the workflow and user experience is, and how tactile and hands-on they feel to use. There are some major limitations, and some of them will just rule potential customers out right off the bat. But if you can put up with those, and if you're anything like me, I think you'll have a great time with either circuit, whether you're a new producer or an experienced one. Now, I mentioned my other go-to, the MPC-1. If you'd like to see my review of that, you can click or tap up over here. And if you'd like to see a video where I just show a bunch of beats with the Circuit Tracks by itself and the Circuit Rhythm by itself, you can click or tap up over here. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll be back with a new video in a little bit.